Hi, everybody. Welcome to Exploring Your Legal Career in Israel. My name is Allison Spicer. I'm with the Employment Department at Nefesh Benefits. Before we jump into our workshop today with our wonderful panelists, thank you so much for joining. I'd like to introduce Rachel Berger. She is the Vice President of Employment at Nefesh Benefits. I'd love to invite Rachel to tell us a little bit about a project that she's been working on and her thoughts on this topic, this field in Israel. Rachel.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you for having me here this evening. I wanted to share with all of you potential Olim that are listening to us that Nefesh Benefesh has been involved over the last, I don't know, say about a year, working with law firms and with companies to find opportunities for you even before you come. And what that means is that we have created connections with all of the major law firms, with tech companies, with different, with smaller firms, with different opportunities for you to find yourselves here in Israel. And a lot of these positions are on our job board, and you can look at them at nbn.org.il/job board. But we encourage you to submit your CV. Even if you are half a year out of your Aliyah, you should know that the firms have been in touch with us and have said to us, please, 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 make sure the Olim know that we're interested in talking to them. Tonight, you're going to hear from some wonderful people about their career and their trajectory here in Israel and how they have both contributed to the legal field and to Israel in their profession. But I would really appreciate it if you can send me your resume and I can help you make these connections. I'm going to say that my email is rachel@nbn.org.il, and I'm going to also put it in the chat so that you can send me your resume after this webinar. Thank you so much, Allison.
Thanks, Rachel. That was great. Before we introduce our panelists, I just want to remind everybody that you can send us an email at any time with questions about your career path. You have questions about employment planning for Israel. Our team's email address is employment@nbn.org.il, and that's located in the chat box. If you have questions during this workshop that you'd like to throw to our panelists, please put that in the Q&A and not the chat box. It'll just be easier for us to keep an eye on that. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists. And since we are talking about Aliyah and moving to Israel, Gil, why don't you start? I'd love for you to introduce yourself and also tell us a little bit of how you got to Israel. What's your Aliyah story?
My pleasure. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So my name is Gil White. I since the 1st of June this year, became the managing partner of Herzog Fox & Ament, which is Israel's largest law firm. We are around 450 attorneys, 70 stagiaires trainees, which is the same as first-year associates in the US, and another 100 or so support staff. I first walked through the doors of the office on the 20th of March 2000. For some reason, I'd always remember the date. Having been born in Israel, but as a baby, my parents left Israel. I grew up in the UK, studied at University College London, worked at a large firm in London that happened to be involved in Israel's first project finance deal. If anyone knows Road Number 6 in Israel, the Cross Israel Highway, it was the first project finance deal in Israel. At the end of the deal, the then managing partner of the firm I'm at now reached out and said, "Let's meet for a drink." The weirdest drink, the weirdest job offer. This is Israel. This is the Middle East. We made Aliyah. I actually didn't know how much I was earning. This was a long time ago. The world has changed. I arrived as a young pup lawyer. Grew up in the firm, joined a firm of 40 lawyers, which became a firm of 450 lawyers in the time I was there. I've had an amazing ride. The change in the legal profession in Israel is very much the change in the economy in Israel. The economy in Israel is insane, has been for many years, continues to grow, as does the legal profession, as do the opportunities for lawyers. And we see many Olim coming into the firm who integrate very quickly. But Alison, I'm sure we'll get onto those conversations. So my Aliyah story was a fun one, married with a young baby. And here I am 20-something years later telling the tale.
And still smiling, so that's great.
Always smiling, Alison.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gil. We'll get back to you in just a minute. Jeremy, over to you. Go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your Aliyah story.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. Jeremy Ament, grew up in Chicago, born and raised there. And before going to college, I attended the Yeshivat Hesder in Israel, Shalavim, as an American, which was important for my Aliyah story because it immersed me in not just the Jewish aspects, but the Hebrew aspects. So I gained a lot of Hebrew that year. Went back to the States, studied at the Wharton School of Business, got a BS there with a concentration in accounting, and studied modern European intellectual history at the University of Pennsylvania's College of Arts and Sciences. Came back to Israel for a second year at Har Etzion Gush, where I, again, in addition to the Jewish aspects, immersed myself with Israelis in Hebrew, which to this day has been very helpful. And then went back to the States and studied law at Columbia Law School, and worked for half a dozen years in the US at large Midtown Manhattan law firms, Dewey Ballantine, Schulte, Roth and Zabel, doing things like mergers and acquisitions, securities offerings, general corporate work, intellectual property, leverage leasing of large aircraft and fertilizer plants, lots of really interesting stuff. And then as our oldest of our three daughters turned 6, we decided she was going to start to learn Hebrew or learn language. And so we made Aliyah. Because of her, our plan to make Aliyah was driven by making it an adjustment that our kids could best weather. And we came, I guess, like Gil, we came in our case, not 2 months, but 4 weeks before the second Intifada in the year 2000. And my first job, I decided to stop the law firm life, which was excellent for me, but was extremely time consuming. And our making Aliyah for us was a family adjustment. And so I've been working as an in-house counsel ever since, first as a general counsel for an internet investment firm in Jerusalem, back when the internet was hot. And then in 2001, there was an internet bubble and the entire company and all of the technology park in Jerusalem emptied out. And so I ended up moving right over to Converse, a high-tech company, but much larger and much more stable. And so we live in Gush Etzion in Efrat, but I've been working since 2001 in the Tel Aviv Ra'anana area. So I've been working, I worked at Converse until Converse was basically bought by Amdocs, and I moved over to Amdocs, and I've been at Amdocs ever since for 6 years. Doing commercial work, none of the other work that I did is directly transferable. However, as I think was mentioned, there are adjustments made. There's lots of room for growth in different areas, and having English language, American, in my case, American law school background, and having general business background have helped me make the adjustment. And we now live in Efrat, 6 children, 1 married, and that's our basic Aliyah story.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jeremy. And last but not least, Shauna.
Hi, my name is Shauna Hook. I think I'm the baby Ola of this story. I've only been here since 2005. And I was the one who had absolutely no interest in moving to Israel. I grew up in Denver, born and raised in Denver, met my husband in New York. All along, he was saying, yeah, I want to move to Israel. I want to move to Israel. I said, yeah. When our first kid goes into 1st grade, we'll make Aliyah, don't worry. Because who was ever having kids and whose kid was ever going to be that old? And sure enough, just like clockwork, when our first child started 1st grade, I said, okay, what do we have to lose? I kept my job in my law firm the first year that I was here, only to realize that if I really wanted to succeed in Israel, I needed a job in Israel. It was too difficult to balance everything and still be able to maintain the lifestyle that we wanted in Israel. We left the US not only for our children, but also for a lifestyle choice. I was working in a very large law firm in New York and had no life and had a nanny raising my children. And these are all things that I didn't want for my family, and my husband didn't either. So came here and made the switch to actually be an in-house counsel because I was terrified of Hebrew at the time, and still am in many respects, but have been in-house ever since, and fortunately have landed in amazing companies, both at Converse with Jeremy, as well as Get Taxi. I was the first general counsel there, the first general counsel at Lightrix, and now the first general counsel at Moon Active, all unicorn companies. So it's been fascinating. The things that I've touched, from doing the largest single financing round in the country at the time with Volkswagen's investment into Get, to very large M&As, sort of basic transactional work. It really is the gambit of everything that people talk about Israel and high tech for. And the legal profession here, as Gil said, is expanding all the time. It's very exciting. There's tremendous opportunity. And happily, my English, which is still and will always be stronger than my Hebrew, has turned out to be an asset. And I think is for most US trained lawyers, certainly. And, been fortunate not only to work with people on this panel, but some of the best lawyers that you can meet and the best people that you can meet. So there's just tremendous opportunity here.
Wonderful. That's a great start, but I'd actually love for you to talk a little bit more about your transition to working as an Israeli lawyer. You mentioned that you actually kept your job from abroad here for a year and then said, wait, this isn't it. A lot of people talk to me in their planning before they make Aliyah, and a focus for a lot of lawyers is, how do I make that move? What does the bureaucracy look like? What does all the paperwork look like? Do I need to do Dinei Israel? Do I need to be admitted to the Israeli bar? And I know that everybody's experience is a little bit different depending on what path they choose to take. So Shauna, can you tell us a little bit about your transition from being a US lawyer to an Israeli lawyer? What did that look like for you?
So technically, I'm not an Israeli lawyer. In my day, they sort of transferred from having to take the Israeli bar into just registering as a foreign lawyer. So that's the path that I chose. I think the other two panelists did not choose that path, if I'm correct. For me, actually, the biggest transition was to let go of my ego completely. What I found when I got here is that I needed to start over. And I went from a 6-figure income to 14,000 shekels a month. And it quickly grew because I think you develop and you kind of prove yourself quickly. But you have to just kind of let go of it and say, this is the path that I've chosen. These are the consequences to that path. And I know and feel confident in yourself and the network around you, who are incredibly supportive. Certainly the Anglo network of lawyers I have found in this country to be tremendously supportive of each other. That to me was the key, was to say, okay, I'm going to move to become an Israeli-based lawyer. And to get into that market took sacrifice. And it wasn't easy. And it's still not easy in many respects, but I think the profession is not an easy profession necessarily. But for me, it was kind of letting go of the ego, starting over, knowing that I have people around that are supportive, including my family, by the way, for sure, and just going for it.
That's great. I've definitely heard that myself. I've heard that about the Anglo lawyers in Israel as a really supportive group. Gil, let's go over to you. Tell us about your making that jump from being a lawyer in the UK to a lawyer with 2 feet here in Israel.
So bureaucracy is always an issue, but bureaucracy is an issue everywhere. So there isn't one answer, and the rules change. But if you come as a junior attorney, you need to do Dinei Israel. Nobody ever fails Dinei Israel. You need to do stage, and you need to do the Israeli bar exams at the end. if you come with, I think, 5 years experience, you just need to do Dinei Israel. You don't need to do the Israeli bar. Those rules change the whole time, and I'm sure the Nefesh Benefits folks or the Israeli bar can answer the technical questions.
Yeah, there's always current information up on our website.
So there's always a question of salary, right? US lawyers from their first day out of school are earning significant salaries. Israeli lawyers in their first day out of school are not earning significant salaries. That is an issue, but not really an issue, because over time, lawyers earn nicely in Israel. Salaries are going up for lawyers in Israel. Packages in Israel, particularly for people coming from abroad with experience, are almost custom made. There isn't a figure which is, you know, a 4-year attorney coming out of Skadden or Chadbourne or another big Wall Street firm will get X, or a lawyer coming out of a smaller firm will get Y. Those suits are really cut and tailored to fit individual people. The majority of the legal work in Israel today is in English. Whilst you may communicate with clients in Hebrew, the written language, other than domestic litigation or real estate work, is all in English. And those skills are definitely transferable. The quality and type of legal work done, particularly, I'm sure the work Jeremy and Shauna are doing and the work that most lawyers in my firm are doing, is of the same level. Oftentimes the same clients, and these days almost the same dollar valuations as work being done outside of Israel. And therefore, whilst the transition is an interesting one conceptually, philosophically, culturally, when you get down in front of your computer, you open a document and you start working on it, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the work people will find themselves doing in the corporate, commercial, IP type world in the US compared to what their counterparts will be doing in Israel.
Great. Gil, earlier you mentioned a whole lot of interesting projects that you're working on or you've been working on, and we continue to kind of compare what your life as a lawyer looks like in Israel versus before you got here. What does your typical day or typical week look like? What does your work-life balance look like? Give us a little bit of an insight to what you do on a regular basis.
Such an interesting question. I'm going to start, Alison, with the work-life balance. In our office over the last 4 years, we have made up more female partners than male partners. Each of those female partners has a family at times, whether they are religious or not religious, of 3 or 4 children. Our office has every year an annual Hanukkah party for families. We end up with 1,000 people, most of them under the age of 15. Work-life balance is a different concept in Israel than elsewhere, because even we as a law firm where people work really hard, where kids have their end of year graduation, parents are at their end of year graduation, where kids have a birthday party, the parents will go to their birthday party. So yeah, we work super hard, as people do all over the world over. This is, I think Shauna said, a tough profession. People work hard, but I think work-life balance in Israel is a different beast to work-life balance outside of Israel, particularly from a family perspective. What's your average day? It's an interesting question. Your average day is waking up to emails, answering emails the whole day, and answering emails as you go to bed. Israeli clients are probably a little more informal than American clients, and my Israeli clients will be WhatsApping me as well as emailing me, and that's pretty natural. You know, but we'll be in client meetings, we'll be on Zoom, we used to do audio conference calls, right? They disappeared, everyone wants to see you. You know, days are busy. You know, I'm probably not at the point anymore. I'm sitting myself drafting agreements, but I'm reviewing agreements. I'm sitting with associates, with junior partners, with trainees. From that perspective, the day in the life of an Israeli lawyer is probably very little different than the day in the life of lawyers all over the globe. As I say, that transition from when you sit in front of your desk is really not very different.
Interesting. Jeremy, I'd love to throw the same question to you. Talk to us a little bit about what you see as your work-life balance.
Sure.
What does your typical day or week look
Sure.
like?
Our decision to make Aliyah and my decision to not be working at a law firm has been steady working for companies, even though the companies that I've worked for are very hardworking places, was driven by the lifestyle change, the work-family balance, and placing a certain prioritization between the two. So part of the working for these global companies such as Amdocs or Converse or ones with global reach that Shauna works for as well is that you have customers all over the world. So in the world of certainly of COVID, but even before COVID, largely the aspiration is to work by email, by phone call, but it also includes travel. So, I found myself one year going 3 times to Australia in the span of 5 months, but at the same time, because of the company I work for, and because I'm in Israel, and because of the priority, I literally left Motzei Shabbat, went to Australia, did a negotiation, and on Thursday turned around and made sure that on Friday morning at 8 a.m. I was in Hebron at Marat HaMachpelah, where my son was having his Siyum Sefer Breshit, reading the end of Sefer Breshit, and there with him, and the company understood I was going to be home for Shabbat. They respected that there was something going on in the family, and for me, it made every difference in the world. But even when not traveling, Gil mentioned the idea of making parties, etc. For me, one of the key drivers of the places I've worked at has been flexibility. Shauna and I, both at Converse and at Amdocs, I've found tremendous flexibility, whether working from home before COVID even or not. My customers are sitting everywhere in Europe, everywhere in Asia. They don't care whether I'm sitting in the office or I'm sitting in my living room in my office at home, as long as I'm taking care of their needs and answering their needs, and my internal customers at the company as well. So I'm able to do various things in the course of the week for family, including allow my wife, who has her own career, to have the space on certain long days to handle things, and it's understood at work. And this is a very important part of our sort of family rhythm, while at the same time working very long hours at times to get things done for global companies that have they're publicly traded and need to make their $1 billion of revenue a quarter. So it's a combination of those things. An average day includes being at home, helping the family at the beginning of the day, dealing with work, and then sometimes weaving in and out of it between meetings, between preparing documents, getting back to someone on a problem, and sometimes after the kids are back in bed, re-engaging in what you need to do.
That's great, thanks. Shauna, Gil actually touched upon earlier in terms of the amount of Hebrew or the amount of English that he uses in his professional work. I'd love to actually explore that with you a little bit, Shauna. How much Hebrew do you use in your professional work?
Socially, professionally, a lot.
I guess everything,
Okay,
from
I mean,
talking to people in the corridor to
like,
emails.
The office operates in English. All the offices I've ever worked with operate in English. It's actually interesting because when I was up for the job at Get Taxi, the interview was in Hebrew. So eventually they switched to English, and the CFO who was interviewing me and the CEO who was interviewing me, I found out later, had a discussion about my level of Hebrew. And the comment from the CEO was, we can hire somebody for Hebrew. We want somebody who has the skills that we need in order to achieve what we want to achieve. On a social level, there's Hebrew all the time. My WhatsApps are in Hebrew. My conversations are often in Hebrew. I sit in meetings in Hebrew all the time. My professional work, as Gil said, I would say it's 99.9% in English. And the Hebrew documents I give to an Israeli trained lawyer who works for me, because even if for me, and I'm sure this is different, certainly with Gil and maybe with Jeremy as well, I still am not as comfortable as I would want to be in Hebrew on a document level than I am in English. And for me, I find it sort of irresponsible when I have somebody sitting next to me who is much more proficient than I am. I'm fortunate like that. I'm not sure everybody has that ability to kind of hand off that stuff. But again, as I said before, and I think the other two have said as well, the skills that we bring to the table, and that lawyers who are coming into this market, the training and experience that they tend to have coming into this market is invaluable. And I think most places see that and are, I think, less concerned about the Hebrew skills, because there's always somebody around with the Hebrew skills.
Who can fill that piece in? Yeah. Jeremy, I saw you nodding. Is that your
Yes.
experience as well?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, your English is an asset. Your English ability to communicate in writing, in thinking, in providing suggestions is an absolute asset and is the lingua franca of transactions the world over. And like Shauna said, socially, in terms of interaction with colleagues, and winning their confidence and having another language you can go to sometimes in front of others, your version of Japanese, it's nice to have the Hebrew. And it certainly is very helpful to have it. But in terms of drafting itself, with the companies I've worked at, they've given me some Israeli customers and clients. Largely in English are the documents. Occasionally they are in Hebrew. And while I can handle it, like Shauna said, you either have an outside counsel or another person who's qualified or more qualified. Say if you really need something that's very, very specific within Hebrew. Hebrew is an asset. One of the things I would ask, suggest is, whether you get yourself a newspaper every week or whatever else to engage in it, it can be very helpful socially. But in terms of the core skills that they're looking for, we're not exporting oranges anymore, we're exporting technology. And in order to make those transactions technology, they're looking to us as native English communicators to use our skills to get the job done, as Shauna said.
That's great. I've been keeping an eye on the questions in the Q&A. Thank you, everybody. I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions. Feel free to follow up with us at employment@nbn.org.il. The email address for that is in the chat. But I do see quite a lot of questions asking about transitioning, or asking about options to transition from one field to another. There are a lot of people who come from a background in government, in real estate, in litigation. And I want to throw the question out there to the panel, whoever would like to answer. How easy is it for a lawyer from one background to pivot, transition into a different field, a different concentration of law than they previously worked in? How open are companies, are firms to people making that pivot?
If I can give one anecdote, we have a person in the department that I work in, and we deal with transactions in Europe, Middle East, Africa, etc. A person who spent 20 years doing pension work and trust work in England. And he's now doing commercial transactions of contracts. Okay, he made a complete pivot, but English speaker, knows how to negotiate, knows how to be thoughtful in thinking through an issue, knows how to write and draft. He happened to be working in a completely different area of law and made the pivot and understood that, he's working in a group that can provide support and some amount of training involved. But if you have those core skills to negotiate, to understand how to negotiate, to do it in English, to be able to write and communicate effectively, then, there may be an amount of traction that you have to gain in a particular area, especially if it's more specialized than, let's say, general commercial law. But there are new, Gil deals with e-commerce. E-commerce now, as opposed to e-commerce 20 years ago, it's a completely different world. New fields have opened up, like data privacy, that didn't exist then back then. So if a person's open to recognizing that new subfields open up and a person can dive in, and they have certain core facilities of how to communicate and to analyze, that can be very helpful. That's my view.
Yeah, one of the things that I actually do a lot with Noelim, who contact me, and I'm sure the others do as well, is kind of have this fundamental talk about what are your skills. Forget what your practice area is. What do you define as your core skills, as Jeremy was saying? And how do you transition those skills into something else? When I came to Israel, all of a sudden I was a real estate attorney, which I am not. You learn it, you have to be innovative, you have to be open to where your opportunities present themselves, like anywhere else in the world. But as Jeremy said, it's your core skills that will get you there. It's core skills and recognizing opportunity, in my opinion, that kind of open the doors for you. And no matter what door is open for you, you've got to be the one pushing it open to get there and to succeed. And that sometimes takes, I remember sitting at nights kind of learning terms of art and other things in areas that I knew nothing about. That's still true today. When privacy came, what did I know about privacy? When, especially in-house, you're hit with things all the time, and probably in firms as well, you're hit with things all the time that you've never dealt with. And you have to be able to maneuver and figure it out. So I think that's no different anywhere in the world than it is in Israel. I think the core difference is, and I said it before, a very strong network of people around you who you can pick up the phone and say, have you ever dealt with this before? And people are extraordinarily willing to help. And really to not only to introduce you to other people who they know, but also to help you themselves.
That's great. Yeah, I echo that as well. I see that in many fields, that being open-minded, and also looking at what are your transferable skills, what are your skills that could take you in a different direction, is really the key to figuring out the path. And I'm happy to hear that that's your experience as well in law. Let's continue the conversation about the law field a little bit in Israel, and I'll throw the question open to the panel. Do you see any particular trends, patterns? Do you see firms or companies focusing on one area more than another? Do you see, what do you hear at conferences? What are continuing education courses focusing on? What's going on today from your vantage point?
So maybe I'll jump in. Everybody looks at Israel as the startup nation, or now the high-tech nation, because we have Jeremy and Shauna here from unicorns, which maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago would have been sold when they were much smaller, and now we have these huge companies. So technology is clearly a key driver of the economy, and therefore a key driver of the legal profession. But technology spawns a whole host of different traditional areas of the law. If that's corporate work, if it's commercial work, if it's IP work, if it's this whole change over the last few years, which Shauna mentions, of privacy, if it's employment work, employment benefit work, it's all the same skill set, but just applied to various industries. There's still a whole bunch of old economy work in Israel. So, I think the trends today, what we look for, which is a little strange because the legal world is becoming much more specialist or specialized, I'm forgetting my English, particularly outside of Israel. And one of the skills we look for is people who have a wider breadth of knowledge, which ties into the skill sets which Shauna and Jeremy were talking about, and the applicability of skill sets to new areas. So whilst we may recruit somebody who's an antitrust lawyer, but we really would love them to have some more commercial experience as well. And the same is really true all over. So whilst the world is moving to specializations, at least we're still trying to keep people with slightly more rounded knowledge.
Well-rounded, I think, is definitely what I'm hearing from a lot of people. They want somebody who does this, but also knows marketing and things like that. So I definitely agree with that as well. When Rachel was speaking at the beginning of this workshop, she was talking about the huge number of positions that are open right now for lawyers. So for anybody listening, please go ahead and send us your resume. We can always try to pass it along for relevant positions. But what I would love to hear from the panel is, do you hear about ageism in the field? There's a question in our Q&A about ageism. Do you hear that people are only looking to hire juniors, people who are fresh out of law school? Do you think that there's room in the Israeli workforce today for people over 50 to be looking for a job as a lawyer in Israel? Shauna, you wanna take a stab at that?
Sure. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope there's room. I don't know how old the panelists are, but I can say that I'm about to be in the next box. I think there are opportunities here. Look, from a high-tech world perspective, I'm for sure the adult in the room most of the time. I mean, you're talking about founders who are in their early 30s, sometimes younger, and a lot of sort of tech people that are coming out of the army or others that are starting these companies that explode. And then they bring in people like us who, you know, kind of help them figure it out. So I think in that respect, experience is critical. And people are, I think, less concerned about age. That being said, pace is the pace. So it doesn't matter if you're 30 or if you're 70, you got to keep up. And
There's still a full workload.
There's still a full workload, and the pace is extreme in some cases. You know, I was doing a deal last week and was up consistently till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning all night, which again, you would have in a law firm as well. And, you know, sitting in New York or wherever you are. So I think there is appetite. I think there is some ageism. I think some of it's cultural and some of it's just reality in the market overall. But I think, again, certainly in-house, I can't speak to law firms, but certainly in-house experience is really what they're looking for. And I see less hires, and I've advertised for less hires that are in junior positions. Those are less valuable to me.
You're looking for more senior corporate.
For more senior people who have the experience that we need, because we can't stop and train. I don't know, Gil, if that's your experience also, but you know, for us, we're moving so fast that experience is much more important.
Look, in a law firm, it's probably slightly different, Shauna, because you know we have the whole, for want of a word, food chain, and for us, juniors become seniors and become partners. So we need to constantly be refilling. Look, it would be trite to say there is no ageism. But I think that just given the number of opportunities today in the market in Israel, and I peeked in the Q&A and somebody mentioned sole practitioners as opposed to big law firms, and clearly there is room in Israel for people who've not just worked at big law firms in the US or elsewhere. I think we've all said it, and the Nefesh Benefits folks have said it as well. There are very, very many opportunities today in Israel, particularly in the legal profession. And if people are coming with a lot of experience, you know, they may well find a particular niche which is looking for somebody with that type of experience. You know, Israeli companies are opening all over the world. And whilst their headquarters may be in Israel and then the skill sets in Israel, but they may be looking for people who have a particular speciality in a particular jurisdiction. So, you know, I don't want anybody to think that the three of us on the panel are focusing just on big transactions or just on big law firms. That just happens to be our experience. But the market is really ripe for people of a whole bunch of different backgrounds and experiences and law firms that they came from. So don't let us deter you that this is just for big law firms or for big corporates. You know, this country is made up of a whole tapestry of different law firms and different companies looking for legal advice.
Thank you for that, Gil. That's great. I'll throw this question to anybody who would like to answer. What has surprised you most about your work as a lawyer in Israel? Or put another way, a position that you were able to get that surprised you, the work that you did, that's something that was not what you were expecting here. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I don't know how much has surprised me, but I've been reinforced in my sense over the excuse me, over the years, and how much a core English, you know, U.S. trained or UK trained skill set coming in as a lawyer actually continues to be something that's not so prevalent and is much appreciated and is valued, despite the fact, or you know, that that it's clear, as Gil talked about, technology nation, startup nation, and the proliferation of these companies that are reaching out to the world and dealing in English, but they still look to, and I'll get turned to all the time by people in the company asking me to help them with on something in English, or to ask me my thought on something, and to a certain extent, it surprised me that it continues to, when we were talking about that there are all these job openings, etc., there really is, it seems to be, quite a demand for that kind of skill set and that kind of facility. And so in some ways, we were talking about before about the Hebrew, because I haven't had to work, even though I am an Israeli lawyer, I haven't had to work as an Israeli lawyer. My use of my Israeli lawyer skills is using my stamp to help people sign affidavits on my block for various things that they need, or to help them on the signature for a document, is pretty much the way I use it. I was surprised a little bit at how little my being an actual Israeli lawyer was needed. Maybe it was needed for a credential, it was needed to fill out a job requirement, but there are positions, not just mine anecdotally, but knowing the proliferation of opportunities there, that when a person's first coming, they don't necessarily need to feel an urgency to immediately ramp up as an Israeli lawyer. They can perhaps ease themselves into it, or decide, like Shauna, to not to do it, because she's found that there's traction without having to necessarily check that box. There's enough space to find one space, and there have been ups and downs in the economy. When Gil and I came here in 2000, it was a hot market, and then 10 years later, not so much. But we're back to a time that it is a ripe moment for coming back to a place where you'd be surprised to know how you don't necessarily need to be a full-blown Israeli lawyer right off the bat to gain traction in the job market.
And I'd like to add one thing to what Jeremy said also, which also really surprised me. And that's the skills that I took for granted. Here, you don't take them for granted, meaning, things that every day something will happen and it's like, well, isn't that obvious? Or doesn't everybody know that? Just based on the training that I had. And it's just not the case here. I mean, there are things that people haven't touched on that you may have, and your various skill sets really do matter. And the things that maybe in the US, there's 150,000 people who know that, it's not necessarily true here. So, don't take your skill sets for granted. Don't think that, because you're one in a million in the US or wherever you are right now, it means you'll be the same here. I have not experienced that, and it always surprises me.
If I can add one
please.
thing, when Shauna says that, certainly she means legal skills, and maybe she means non-legal skills. But I would say if you're a person that has had background in, think of some other thing that you once did, whether it's marketing, whether it's advertising, whether it's some other skill. When you find yourselves in a position, you may find that actually will help you not only work internally within the company or within the firm, but you might find it provides you a certain entree into other flexibility within the job, or to expand further, and not necessarily a specific legal training, but other things that you take for granted, but actually, like Shauna said, may actually turn out to be something that actually can contribute quite a bit to your career development here, even within the legal world, but something that can help in a company or help in a firm in another field.
That's great. We're actually almost out of time. So as we start to wrap up, I do want to remind everybody that if you did not get to have your question answered, please go ahead and send us an email. I'm also happy to receive your resume, even if you're not quite ready to jump on the plane yet. We're happy to start the conversation about building your career in law here in Israel. And you can also reach out to us to get in touch with any of our awesome panelists this evening. I'd like to conclude by starting with Jeremy and then going around to everybody and give you an opportunity to give over some advice to somebody who may be planning on making Aliyah, who's in law or thinking about making Aliyah. What sort of advice or guidance or tips would you give them from where you're sitting today?
Okay, first of all, I just want to thank you again, Allison, for having me on the panel.
Thank you very much.
A few things, and not necessarily legal per se, although a little bit. if you're not yet fully comfortable with your Hebrew, and Lord knows I'm still not, immersing yourself in some way in Hebrew communication. So back in the day, before we made Aliyah, there were no podcasts that didn't exist in the world, you know, but like every Friday where we lived in Brooklyn by the subway tracks, I'd pick up a paper, right? A Haaretz or a Yediot or something. And over the course of the weekend, I'd slowly plug my way through it and look up words I didn't understand, etc. And in some ways immerse myself. These days, you know, with your earphones and finding something else, you can. I'm not talking about making yourself taking a Berlitz course and being fully, fluid in being able to speak Hebrew, which is nice. It's great, but to immerse yourself in some way, so because it will help you over time in the transition here generally, and also within where you may be working. In terms of a general skill, if negotiation. If you find some sort of book, seminar, YouTubes, anything about the art of negotiation, and I'm not just talking about negotiation you may do as a lawyer in a contract or with another side, but even for your job or even within the general society in Israel. And I don't just mean pounding the table and screaming negotiating. I mean learning to skillfully and civilly engage, but firmly communicate your view so you can disagree in a way but still maintain good civil discussion. That is an actual skill that can serve you well in many different contexts, including at a firm, including at a company, including as a sole practitioner, including with an employer. And and sometimes we take it for granted, think, oh, I'll figure it out, and oh, it's pretty instinctive. Yes, it is, but also engaging in it and actually practicing a little bit can actually serve one well, in my opinion.
That's great advice. Gil, over to you. Advice, guidance, tips that you would give a lawyer in the UK, Canada, the US, somebody thinking about making Aliyah or planning already on making Aliyah.
So the first tip I think is that making Aliyah is in and of itself a challenge, whether you're a lawyer or a nurse or a teacher or whatever you are. And therefore, the most important thing is to make a successful Aliyah. And making a successful Aliyah, from my perspective, is integrating yourself into Israel. I think one of the things that COVID taught us on one hand is that you can work from anywhere, right? You have three of us, all of whom are at home now. And therefore, you could make Aliyah and keep working for your US firm and carry on. And you could work all night because you need to work on Eastern time or Pacific time or Mountain time or many other times you have in North America. But there are really great opportunities today. If you research the Israeli market, either I'm sure through Nefesh Benefits, or feel free to reach out to any of us or anyone else you know, as Shauna's kept saying, rightly so. I don't know anyone in the Anglo legal community who a potential lawyer would reach out to them and wouldn't give you as much time as you need. But there are amazing opportunities in Israel to work in Israel or to work for Israeli companies or Israeli law firms. And that's, from my perspective, I've seen many olim over the years. Integrating you and people who come with a partner or come with a family, that's the number one challenge. Working is the number two challenge. But in order for it all to fit together, I would really think twice about not integrating into the Israeli workforce.
Great perspective.
That's my Zionist speech for the evening, Alison.
It's great perspective. That's a great perspective. 100%. All right, Shauna, last but not least, advice, guidance, tips that you would give somebody who's a lawyer in the States, Canada, who's planning on making Aliyah, thinking about making Aliyah.
First of all, I completely agree both with Jimmy and Gil's advice, for sure. I think the one piece of advice that somebody gave me was you can get anywhere from anywhere. So don't get caught up in trying to figure out exactly how to get started. Just start. And, you got to network yourself around, and you can't be afraid of it. There's resources, Nefesh Benefits and others out there. You just need to get going and stop making excuses for it. I mean, all of us could have sat wherever we were and lived a very comfortable, very nice lifestyle. And thank God, I think we are. Even in Israel, being successful in our fields, thank God successful with our families, but don't get caught in your head, because you will fail if you get caught in your head. Let us help you. Let us, let the resources help you and guide you. And I completely agree. A successful Aliyah, you got to focus on your family. Make sure that they're stable, because no matter how successful you are, if your family is not stable, you will not succeed. And I was fortunate to be actually able to have a year to do that. It's not so easy. It came at a cost also of Ulpan and other things that I couldn't do, but you jump in. You jump in and you have the amuna that we all have to come here having, and hopefully it sticks. And you work with what you've got. So, and completely agree with Gil, integrate into Israel. If you don't integrate into Israel, then you're never going to be Israeli. I'm never going to be Israeli anyway. That's hard enough. But if I didn't integrate into Israel, work-wise, for sure you're not. So, don't just follow your kid's path. Follow your path, but jump in. There's no other way to do it in my view. There's no other way.
Jump in. I love it. That's a great slogan. Work on integrating, network, talk to people. I love how much I've heard this evening about the really supportive English-speaking law community here in Israel. So I encourage all of our viewers to reach out to us. We're happy to put you in touch with our panelists. I'd love to take this opportunity to thank Rachel Berger again, Vice President of Employment. You can reach her at rachel@nbn.org.il. You can reach our employment team at employment@nbn.org.il. And I wanted to say thank you so much, Gil, Shauna, and Jeremy. This was wonderful, great advice, great inspiration, and I encourage all of our viewers to be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.